This week on Scripturology.
So no matter where you are in the best possible place for your long-term good. And that's true even if you're in a place of suffering. It's true if you've been misunderstood and wronged. And it's even true if where you are is the result of your own sin. Psychologists tell us that people have one of two instincts when faced with physical danger: fight or flight. I had the opportunity to learn what my own response was several years ago in a frightening situation that I'll spare you the details of. Let's just say old Alexandra is a scrapper when she needs to be. On today's Scripturology lesson, we're going to see the response of the people of Israel when they feel trapped by danger. And we're also going to see a surprising alternative response to fight or flight. The first part of Exodus 13, verses 3 through 10, is mostly a reiteration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that we learned about last week. But verse 2 is something new, and Moses comes back to it in detail in the part of the chapter that we're going to read now. We'll continue reading past that to the text to see the final steps of the Exodus as well. Now follow along or listen as I read Exodus chapter 13, verses 11 through 12. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord has brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I shall redeem. It shall be as a mark on your head, hand, or frontlets between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up with you from here. And they moved on from Succoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they also might travel by day or by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. When we studied the institution of the Passover meal last week, we noted that God was teaching his people about salvation. The fact that the meal was only for those that bore the sign of the covenant, it touched on the concept of election. God chooses his people. The slaughter of a perfect lamb pictured the substitutionary atonement, that is, a blood sacrifice that substitutes for another's punishment. The fact that God's wrath was turned away by the blood of the lamb revealed the concept of propitiation, to appease another's anger by a gift. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread signified the requirement of sanctification, which means to be made pure or holy. The Passover meal was one big theology lesson for the Israelites, as well as for us who read about it. And now we have another bit of theology that deals with salvation that's presented in this chapter. That is the concept of redemption, to purchase liberation or ransom for another. Now, I've been criticized for doing what I just did, bringing out big theological words in my teaching. And yet, here I go again. I'm intentional about it because it's important to have some precision to our language when we talk about salvation so that we can know what God requires of us. I know that some of you may have never heard these words before because you're young in your faith. But I don't assume that being young in the faith also means that you're an intellectual infant who can't be taught. So I use the theological words and I tell you what they mean. Because if I can be learned, you can be learned. So we read that the Lord would now require of every firstborn son of the Israelite people and their animals would have to be consecrated to God. Now, to be consecrated meant to be dedicated or set apart for God's purposes. Do you know what it meant for the animals to be consecrated? It meant that they were to be slain in sacrifice. Now, one exception is made. Donkeys were considered unclean animals. Unclean animals could not be sacrificed because they were unacceptable to God. However, the firstborn of even the donkeys belonged to Him, but they could be redeemed. When a firstborn donkey came along, a lamb could be sacrificed in its place. The lamb would be payment or ransom for that donkey's life. Okay, that's the animals. How were the firstborn Israelite boys to be consecrated? They were treated just like unclean donkeys. They were to be ransomed with a sacrificed lamb. When an Israelite boy grew older and could ask about the payment that was made for his life, fathers would have the opportunity and the responsibility for explaining that just as God required the lives of firstborn Egyptians in the 10th plague, He had the same requirement of His own people. Okay, why do you think God is treating the firstborn of His own people just like the pagan Egyptians and unclean donkeys? Well, God is communicating two things. First of all, everyone, all people, belong to God, whether they acknowledge Him or not. God made a stipulation about firstborns being consecrated simply because firstborns represented the hope of the entire family. All people belong to God, whether they're firstborns or not, whether they're boys or not, and whether they're Israelites or not. And the reason the Israelite boys aren't treated any differently than the donkeys is because they weren't any cleaner than the donkeys. People are sinful, and the lives of sinful firstborns do not make an acceptable sacrifice to God. We need a Redeemer to ransom us. Now, back then, they used lambs until the perfect Lamb, Jesus Christ, came to die once and for all for sinful people. Now, the Israelites were going to have to hold this instruction under their hats, so to speak, for some time. Verse 11 says they weren't to start practicing this firstborn consecration until after they arrived at their destination, the Promised Land. But now, at least they were on their way. As they're going out the front door of Egypt, they remember to grab something important. Odd, but important. They carry out the mummy of Joseph. And remember, Joseph had been second in the land only to Pharaoh in his day. He would have been given an Egyptian embalming upon his death, and the very last verse of Genesis confirms that. Joseph was so sure that God would keep His promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he made his family swear that when they left Egypt to settle in Canaan, they would take his body with them and bury him there. Well, that was nearly 450 years earlier, but his descendants kept their promise. You know, that promise was carefully passed down through the generations. Well, the text says the people were led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, so they could travel day or night. Now, just like there are folks who try to discount the miraculous nature of the 10 plagues that God had sent to Egypt, there are those who try to explain this pillar away as well. It's postulated that this pillar cloud could have been a tall, narrow cumulus cloud that generated lightning, which would appear to the Hebrews like fire at night. Well, I think Moses knew the difference between lightning and fire, and he could have said that if that were the case. What people can't explain is how this single cloud hung around for 40 years when winds blow and the earth rotates. Okay, natural clouds move. They don't stalk people. The final thing in chapter 13 that we need to note with special attention is that Moses says God did not lead his people in the most direct route to Canaan. Take a look at the map on your screen. Logically, they should have gone northeast, following the solid red line, in which case they would have reached their destination in just 2 weeks. Instead, they went southeast, following the dotted white line. Moses tells us the rationale for God's leading. It was because there would be opposition if the direct route along the coastal road, the Via Maris, was taken. They would have been walking right through Egyptian military outposts. And if they got past those, the Philistines would have attacked them as soon as they crossed the border into Canaan. Remember, the Israelites had been slave laborers for the past 400 plus years. They didn't have battle experience. God knew their response to dangerous opposition would have been to run, not walk, back to Egypt. They were flighters by nature, not fighters. Now, these people might have been cowardly, but they weren't stupid. They surely knew they weren't headed in the right direction. And we don't know if Moses told them the reason they were taking the long route. Now, can you imagine Moses telling 600,000 men, that's how many there were, plus their families, can you imagine him saying, well, we would take the shortcut if you weren't such sissies, but since you are, we're just going to meander a bit. Maybe he kept that information to himself. If he did, then the route they were taking made no sense to the Israelites. They just had to follow their leader. God knew his people, and he knew what was best for them. And you know, that's still true. Do you wish you had $1 for every time you questioned how God was orchestrating the events in your life or the way that he was leading you? He doesn't always put us on the most direct route, does he? And that can be frustrating. But God sees the dangers on the direct route that we don't. And a path that can be good and safe for one person to take could be disastrous for us. And God not only knows what's up ahead, but he knows us and if we can handle it. There is amazing comfort in that. We don't have to know it all. We just have to follow our leader. Romans 8:28 promises that God is working everything out for the good of his own. So no matter where you are in the best possible place for your long-term good. And that's true even if you're in a place of suffering. It's true if you've been misunderstood and wronged. And it's even true if where you are is the result of your own sin. If you belong to God because you've repented of your sin and submitted to the Lordship of Christ, then there are no wasted detours for you. It all has purpose for your good, even if you don't happen to understand how right now. Just thank God for his providence in your life and walk by faith, rejoicing that he knows both the way and you. I don't know about you, but I have some big uncertainty hanging over my head right now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm sleeping good because God does know, and He's on the job. Confidence in God will give you real peace. A lack of confidence in Him results in what we'll see next in our lesson, right after this brief break. I'm so glad you're watching today's program as we study the book of Exodus. Maybe this is the first time you've seen a scripturology program, or maybe you've been studying with us for a while. I want you to know that I have been and continue to be sitting in the student's chair myself. If there's one thing that can irritate me about a Bible study, it's when I feel like my time has been wasted. I consider it wasted if I don't learn something I didn't know before I invested my time with that teacher. That's the mindset I bring to teaching women on scripturology. Do not want to waste your time, and I hope that's evident in our lessons. If you're learning more about God and His Word and how to apply it, I'd ask you to tell a friend about our program. In this way, you can help us in our mission to make faithful disciples of Christ. We'll pick up our lesson by reading Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephron. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And they did so. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal Zephron. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us into the wilderness? What have you done in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent." It wasn't strange enough that God led the Israelites in the opposite direction of their expected destination, but now He has them backtracking. Can you imagine what the people thought of that kind of leadership? It didn't inspire a lot of confidence. But even though it was strange, it was God's best plan for them. The Israelites may not have had any experience with military strategy, but their God was an expert. He was baiting the Egyptians to pursue the Israelites, and the Egyptians fell for it. When Pharaoh learned about the backtracking that the Israelites were doing, he concluded that they were in a state of confusion and they would be easy pickings. He realized the huge economic loss that their departure was, and he was going to remedy the situation. It was just a day earlier that he had asked Moses to bless him, supposedly in recognition of the superiority of the God of the Israelites. And doesn't that just go to remind us that asking for a blessing is not the same thing as bending your knee in repentance? Everyone wants to be blessed. Not everyone is willing to repent. So here Pharaoh comes with hundreds of chariots, which might as well have been Sherman tanks to Israelites on foot. The text said in verse 8 that the people of Israel went out defiantly. In verse 10, they get sight of the Egyptian army coming after them, and then they feared greatly. It's easy to be all defiant and sassy when there's no danger. It's a little harder to maintain that attitude when there's a threat. Well, God called it back in chapter 13. He told Moses the people would want to run back to Egypt as soon as there was trouble. They were probably happy and counting their gold and silver jewelry when they started out the day before. But now they're turning on Moses like he's their enemy. I did have to laugh at the way they phrased their accusation against him. Are there no graves in Egypt? You had to bring us to the wilderness to die? Just like God said, they want to go back. But there's a problem with that now. Now, if they are looking at the Egyptian army, it's in front of them. On either side of them is wide open wilderness that is going to offer no defense. And their backs are up against the Red Sea. They are trapped. They know it, and the Egyptians know it. Well, what advice does Moses give them? Should they try to flee or charge and fight? Which one is their best strategy? The answer is neither. The answer was stand firm and still. Verse 14 is a great verse. We'll put it up for you on your screen. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The only part in their defense the Israelites had to play was to stand still and quit their yammering. Now, they may not have liked or appreciated that instruction, but it's not like they had a choice either. In verse 15 through 18, it seems like Moses thinks that this is a good time to have a quiet time with the Lord. And the first thing God says to him is basically, "Why are you crying to me?" He is not in the least bit sympathetic with any anxiety or distress Moses may have expressed to him. And that's worth noting. See, just like Moses told the people to hush up, God in essence tells Moses the same thing. When God has told you to trust him, and he has in his word, when you know to trust him, quit your crying. Apparently, God gets tired of hearing it. While Moses is having his quiet time, the cloud of God's presence, it's moving. It settled in between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. On the Israelite side of it, it lit up the night, but on the Egyptian side, it stayed black. Then Moses does as God had instructed him, and he raises his hand over the sea. A strong wind blew, and the waters of the sea were divided to create a path and a wall of water on each side. Have you heard this story before? The path was dry, and the Israelites were instructed to move forward now. Standing still time was over. Well, if they could walk through the water, Pharaoh's army didn't see any reason they couldn't either. That was a miscalculation. Psalm 77 tells us something about this event that Moses doesn't record. Take a look. The clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. If the clouds poured out water, that means it rained at some point, and that the dry path had turned to mud. When the Egyptian chariots hit that mud, they got bogged down. They panicked, but they did have one last lucid realization. They said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." They got that right, but it was too late. God instructed Moses again to stretch out his hand over the seas, and when he did, the waters swallowed the entire Egyptian army. Not one soldier walked away. The Israelites could look back and see bodies washing up against the shore. They'd never see an Egyptian military face again. There are non-Christians who hear this story, and even if they acknowledge the existence of God, they're horrified that he would wipe out the Egyptian army so cruelly. And even some who claim to be believers say they're embarrassed by God's actions here because they're mean. But God had a different view. He thought that his actions were a matter of bringing glory to himself. And he said that 3 times in the chapter, in verses 4, 17, and 18. There are a few things that man needs to get straight or remember if they've forgotten. First of all, part of what makes God a holy God is that he loves justice. He's committed to justice. And as humans, we long for justice to be served. I wonder how those who denigrate God for his response to the Egyptians would like him to react if someone threw their newborn son into the Nile River. They might hope that God would bring justice for that and that he wouldn't just turn a blind eye to it. If the Egyptians didn't think anything of drowning Hebrew babies, should they expect better treatment than themselves? The second thing we need to know is that there is no such thing as God being unfair to innocent people, because there's no such thing as innocent people. Every person on earth is born with a sinful nature in rebellion to God. Do some sin more than others? Absolutely. But the standard of righteousness is perfection, not comparatively less than someone else. We're either justified by the substitutionary atonement of Jesus on our behalf, or we die in our sin. Which brings me to the third point. This world needs to brace itself for the reality that God is not through judging sin. Revelation 18 says that the city of Satan will be cast into a sea. I don't imagine it's going to float. God has imposed justice in the past. He imposes judgment today as he deems necessary, and he will judge sin with finality on the day that he is determined in the future. And far from being something to be embarrassed about, God's people will rejoice in that day. Well, perhaps the greatest miracle of the experience of the Red Sea is recorded in the last verse of chapter 14. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so that the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. What the plagues in Egypt didn't accomplish, the annihilation of the Egyptian army did. It convinced God's people to believe in him, and that was to his glory. I hope that you'll join me on Scripturology next week when we see the happy dance that the people of Israel did. We'll be studying chapters 15 and 16.